The cold rain pounded against the window of the stagecoach as Nora Davenport clutched her sleeping infant daughter to her chest, watching the dark outlines of mountains rise against the horizon, mountains that would lead her to Delta, Colorado, a place she'd never been, but now her only hope for survival. The stagecoach lurched over a rut in the road, and Nora steadied herself against the worn leather seat. April 1875 had brought nothing but sorrow, and now she was fleeing west with only a small carpetbag of belongings and the child that her late husband's family refused to accept as their own. "Not much longer now, madam," the driver called back through the small window. "Another hour to Delta, if the weather holds." Nora nodded her thanks, though she doubted he could see it. 6 days of travel had left her exhausted, her dress wrinkled and stained despite her best efforts to remain presentable. At 24, she had never imagined finding herself a widow, much less one cast out by the Harrington family who had once welcomed her with false smiles at her wedding just 18 months ago. "We'll be all right, Elizabeth," she whispered to her daughter, who slept peacefully against her shoulder, unaware that her very existence was now deemed scandalous by the family that should have protected them both after Thomas's death. The accusation still burned in her ears. "That child cannot be a Harrington," her father-in-law had declared, his face mottled with rage. "Thomas was away fighting for 4 months before your confinement. She is proof of your infidelity, and no Harrington will acknowledge her." It had been in vain to explain that Elizabeth had come early, that the doctor himself had confirmed it was possible. The Harringtons, wealthy Boston merchants, had been looking for any reason to dissolve their connection to the shopkeeper's daughter they had never truly accepted. Thomas's death from pneumonia had given them the opportunity they needed, and within a week of the funeral, Nora found herself and her 3-month-old daughter evicted from the Harrington home with only a pittance to see them on their way. The stagecoach rounded a bend, and the small collection of buildings that made up Delta came into view through the misty rain. Nora felt her heart sink. It was smaller than she'd imagined from her cousin's letters, barely more than a wide spot in the road with a handful of wooden structures lining what appeared to be the main street. "Last stop," the driver called as the coach rolled to a halt in front of a building marked Delta General Store and Post. Nora gathered her carpetbag and carefully maneuvered down the coach steps, holding Elizabeth close beneath her shawl to protect her from the rain. The driver tossed down her small trunk, tipped his hat, and was gone before she could ask directions. Standing alone in the mud of the main street, Nora felt fear climb up her throat. Her cousin Martha had written that she and her husband had a room for Nora, that there was work to be had in this growing frontier town. But the letter was months old now, and Nora had been unable to send word ahead of her arrival. "You look a bit lost, madam." She turned to find a tall man watching her from beneath the overhang of the general store. His clothes were worn but clean denims, boots, and a faded blue shirt under a leather vest. He wore a gun at his hip, like many men in the West, but it was his eyes that caught Nora's attention, kind eyes, deep brown and questioning beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for the Campbell residence," Nora said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Martha and John Campbell." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of something like concern crossing his features. "I'm afraid the Campbells moved on about 2 months back. Headed to California after John couldn't make the ranch pay." Nora felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her last hope gone. She must have swayed, because suddenly the man was at her side, a strong hand at her elbow. "Easy there," he said. "You and your little one better come inside out of this rain." Before she could protest, he had picked up her trunk with one hand and was guiding her toward the store with the other. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and Nora blinked in the relative brightness of the interior, taking in the barrels and shelves stocked with goods. "Nancy," the man called to an older woman behind the counter. "We need some hot tea for this lady." The woman nodded without question and disappeared through a doorway at the back of the store. "I'm Garrett Grayson," the man said, setting down Nora's trunk. "I ranch about 5 miles outside town." "Nora Davenport," she replied automatically, adjusting her hold on Elizabeth, who had begun to stir. "And this is my daughter, Elizabeth. Pleased to meet you both," Garrett said with a slight nod. "Now, what brings you to Delta with no place to stay?" Nora hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. But his steady gaze, and the simple kindness he had already shown broke through her reserve. "My husband died this winter," she explained quietly. "His family did not wish us to remain with them. My cousin Martha wrote that she and John had settled here, and that there might be opportunities for me to support myself and my daughter." She did not mention the accusations, the shame they had tried to place on her. Some things were too painful, too private to share with a man she had just met, no matter how kind he seemed. Garrett's jaw tightened slightly at her explanation, but he simply nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Davenport. And I'm sorry the Campbells aren't here to help you." The woman called Nancy returned with a steaming cup of tea, which she handed to Nora with a sympathetic smile. "Poor dear, you look half frozen. Drink this while we figure things out." "Thank you," Nora said, grateful for the warmth of the cup in her hands. Elizabeth had fully awakened now and was making small fussing sounds. "I don't suppose there's a boarding house in town." Nancy and Garrett exchanged glances. "Miner's Rest takes boarders," Nancy said slowly. "But it's not a place for a lady with a child." "There's the Widow Parker's place," Garrett suggested. "But I believe she's full up with the surveyor's crew in town." Nora felt desperation rising. "Is there anywhere? I can pay, at least for a few nights until I find work and more permanent lodging." Nancy looked troubled. "Jobs are scarce right now, especially for a woman with a baby to mind." "I can sew," Nora said quickly. "I worked in my father's shop before my marriage. I can keep books, serve customers. The town's too small for much of that." Nancy interrupted gently. "Most folks here do for themselves." Elizabeth began to cry in earnest now, her tiny face reddening with the effort. Nora tried to soothe her while balancing the teacup, acutely aware of her predicament growing more desperate by the moment. Garrett Grayson watched her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Mrs. Davenport," he said, "I have a proposition for you. My ranch is short-handed, and I lost my housekeeper to marriage last month. The place is in dire need of someone to cook and keep things in order." Nora stared at him, uncertain. "You're offering me employment? Room and board for you and your daughter, plus wages," he clarified. "It's honest work, though not easy. My bunkhouse has 6 men who eat like bears coming out of hibernation." "It's a respectable position," Nancy added quickly, seeming to sense Nora's hesitation. "Garrett's a good man, runs the Double G Ranch clean and proper." Nora looked from Nancy to Garrett, weighing her limited options. A strange man offering her work on an isolated ranch would normally be cause for caution. But she had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, and Elizabeth's cries were growing more insistent. "I accept your offer, Mr. Grayson," she said finally. "With gratitude." Relief flickered across his face. "Good. My wagon's out back. We'll get you settled before nightfall." Within the hour, Nora found herself seated beside Garrett Grayson in a sturdy wagon, her trunk secured in the back, as they made their way out of town along a muddy trail. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and Elizabeth had fallen back asleep after nursing discreetly in the back room of the store. "The ranch has been in my family for 15 years, Garrett explained as they traveled. "My father claimed the land when this was still part of the Utah Territory. Built it up from nothing." "Your parents still live there?" Nora asked, trying to get a better sense of what awaited her. Garrett shook his head. "Lost them both 3 years ago. Influenza. Been running things on my own since then." "I'm sorry," Nora said, recognizing the familiar shadow of grief that crossed his features. "Life out here is hard," he said simply, "but it has its rewards." As they crested a rise, Nora saw what he meant. Before them stretched a valley, green with spring growth despite the rain, nestled between protective ridges. A creek wound through the center, and near it stood a collection of buildings: a large log house with a stone chimney, a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures. "It's beautiful," Nora said honestly. Garrett's expression softened with pride. "It's home." As they approached the ranch, several men emerged from the barn, curious about the unexpected arrival. Garrett pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard and jumped down, coming around to help Nora descend. "Boys," he called to the men who were gathering. "This is Mrs. Davenport and her daughter. They'll be taking over the housekeeping." The men removed their hats in greeting, though Nora could see curiosity in their eyes as they nodded respectfully. They were a mixed group: an older man with a grizzled beard, A pair of younger men who looked enough alike to be brothers, a stocky Mexican man, and a tall, thin fellow with spectacles that seemed out of place on a ranch. "Mrs. Davenport, these are my hands," Garrett said. "Otto's the foreman." He nodded to the older man. "The Miller brothers, Frank and Jim. Ernesto has been with us since my father's time. And that's Daniel. He handles the books and helps with the stock." "Pleased to meet you all," Nora said with as much dignity as she could muster, aware of her travel-worn appearance. "Let's get you settled in," Garrett said, retrieving her trunk from the wagon. "You can meet everyone properly at supper." He led her to the main house, a solidly built structure with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Inside, it was larger than it had appeared, with a great room that served as both kitchen and dining area, a parlor with mismatched but comfortable-looking furniture, and a hallway that led to several doors. "My room's at the end of the hall," Garrett explained. "You and your daughter can have this one." He pushed open a door to reveal a pleasant bedroom with a large bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. A smaller trundle bed was tucked into one corner. "This was my parents' room," he added, setting down her trunk. "Been empty too long." Nora stepped inside, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Mr. Grayson, this is too much. I expected servants' quarters, not—" "We don't stand on ceremony here," he interrupted. "And there aren't any servants' quarters. The bunkhouse is for the men, and this house has been needing a woman's touch." He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I mean, someone to make it a proper home again." "I understand," Nora said softly. "And I'm grateful." Garrett cleared his throat. "I'll let you get settled. Pumps out back for water if you want to freshen up. Kitchen stocked, though not with much beyond beans and bacon lately. Supper's usually at 6. With that, he retreated, leaving Nora alone with Elizabeth in what would be their new home. As she unpacked her meager belongings and washed away the grime of travel, Nora tried to make sense of the sudden turn her life had taken. From Boston society wife to widowed outcast to ranch housekeeper in the span of a few months. Yet for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a glimmer of hope. By 6 o'clock, Nora had managed to prepare a simple but hearty meal from the provisions she found in the kitchen: a pot of beans improved with onions and a bit of salt pork, cornbread baked in the cast-iron stove, and stewed apples from a barrel of winter-kept fruit. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. The ranch hands filed in, having washed up outside, and took their places at the long table with murmured thanks. Garrett sat at the head, with Nora and Elizabeth, now awake and curious, at the other end. "Mrs. Davenport," Otto said after they had begun eating, "this is the best meal we've had since Mrs. Finch left us to marry that shopkeeper from Grand Junction." The others murmured agreement, and Nora felt a small sense of accomplishment. "Thank you. I'll do better once I understand what supplies are available and what you all prefer. Anything that ain't burned is an improvement," Frank Miller said with a grin, earning a chuckle from the others. "You boys have been taking turns at the cooking, haven't you?" Nora asked, understanding now why Garrett had been so quick to offer her employment. "Trying to," Daniel said, adjusting his spectacles. "Some with more success than others. Jim here nearly poisoned us all with his attempt at stew," Ernesto added with a wink at the younger Miller brother, who reddened. "How was I to know that much pepper would burn a man's insides?" Jim protested, and the table erupted in laughter. Watching them, Nora felt some of her tension ease. These were good men, she could tell. Hard-working and honest in their way. Garrett caught her eye from across the table and gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You'll do fine here." For the first time in months, Nora allowed herself to believe that might be true. Later that night, after the men had returned to the bunkhouse and Garrett had retreated to his room with a mumbled good night, Nora sat on the edge of her bed, watching Elizabeth sleep on the trundle bed she had padded with extra blankets. "We've landed on our feet, little one," she whispered. "For now, at least." But as she prepared for sleep, Nora was aware that her position here was precarious at best. A woman alone was always vulnerable, especially on an isolated ranch with 6 men. Garrett Grayson seemed honorable enough, but she had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. She would work hard, save what money she could, and eventually find a more independent situation for herself and Elizabeth. That was the prudent plan. But as she drifted off to sleep, She couldn't help but remember the kindness in Garrett Grayson's eyes when he had first seen her standing alone in the rain. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Nora settled into her role at the Double G Ranch. She rose before dawn each day to prepare breakfast for the hands, then spent the morning cleaning the house, doing laundry, and caring for Elizabeth. Afternoons were for baking, mending, and preparing supper, which was always a lively affair with all the men gathered around the table sharing stories of the day's work. To her surprise, the ranch hands quickly accepted her presence and treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence, especially after she proved her skill at producing meals far superior to their own attempts. Even Elizabeth became a favorite among the men, who would take turns making faces at her to hear her laugh when they came in from their work. Garrett himself was more difficult to read. He was unfailingly polite, appreciative of her work, and generous with her wages, but he maintained a certain reserve that Nora found puzzling. He worked from dawn until dusk alongside his men, often coming in last for meals, exhausted but determined. It was Otto, the grizzled foreman, who finally provided some insight one afternoon when he caught Nora hanging laundry while Elizabeth napped in a basket nearby. "Boss has had it hard," the old man said, pausing to light his pipe. "Lost his folks, then his brother in the war, then his sister to childbirth. He's the last Grayson standing." Nora paused, a wet shirt in her hands. "I didn't know. He don't talk about it much," Otto continued. "But it changed him. Used to be a real sociable fellow before all that. Now he pours everything into this ranch. He seems like a good man," Nora observed carefully. Otto nodded. "The best I know. Too good sometimes for his own well-being." He puffed on his pipe thoughtfully. "That's why we're all pleased to see you and the little one here. Place needs some life in it again." Before Nora could respond to that startling statement, Otto tipped his hat and ambled off toward the barn, leaving her to wonder about the quiet rancher who had taken them in. That evening, after the men had gone and Elizabeth was asleep, Nora found Garrett still sitting at the table, looking over ledgers by lamplight. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms tanned by the sun, and his dark hair fell across his forehead as he frowned at the figures before him. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, pausing in her task of kneading dough for the next morning's biscuits. He looked up, seeming surprised to find her still awake. "Thank you, but no need to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was making some for myself." This small lie seemed to ease his hesitation, and he nodded. "Then yes, thank you." Nora poured 2 cups from the pot she kept warm at the back of the stove, adding a spoonful of sugar to her own. She brought them to the table, setting Garrett's beside him before taking a seat across the corner, a respectful distance that nonetheless allowed for conversation. "Problems with the accounts?" she asked, nodding toward the ledger. Garrett sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just trying to figure how to make everything stretch until fall. Cattle prices are down, and we've had more expenses than usual this spring." Nora hesitated, then offered, "I used to help my father with his books. I could take a look if you'd like." Surprise crossed his features. "You know bookkeeping? My father believed girls should learn practical skills," she explained. "I kept his accounts for 3 years before my marriage." Garrett studied her for a moment, then pushed the ledger toward her. "I'd welcome another pair of eyes." Nora pulled the book closer and began to review the entries, quickly seeing the pattern of income and expenses. The ranch was solvent, but operating with little margin for error. A bad winter or sickness in the herd could tip the balance from profit to loss. "You're spending more on grain than you might need to," she observed after several minutes. "If you added more meadow grass to your pastures, you could reduce that expense considerably." Garrett leaned forward with interest. "Go on." For the next hour, they discussed various ways to economize without compromising the quality of the operation. Nora suggested several changes to the household expenses as well, offering to make more items from scratch that they had been purchasing ready-made. As they talked, Garrett's reserve gradually melted away, replaced by genuine engagement with her ideas. It was the longest conversation they had shared since her arrival, and Nora found herself enjoying his quick mind and practical outlook. "Mrs. Davenport," he said finally, closing the ledger, "I'm impressed. You've given me several good ideas to consider." "I'm glad to help," she replied honestly. This ranch is providing a home for my daughter and me. Its success matters to me." Something flickered in his eyes at her words, but he simply nodded. "Well, I appreciate it. And I appreciate all you've done these past weeks. The house hasn't felt this much like a home in years." The unexpected warmth in his voice caused Nora to glance down at her coffee cup, suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson." "Garrett," he said, "if we're going to be working together on the books, you might as well use my given name." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Then you must call me Nora." He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening the lines that worry and hard work had carved there. "Nora it is." From that evening on, something shifted between them. Garrett began to seek her opinion on various matters related to the ranch, from menu planning to equipment purchases. He would often linger after supper, helping her clear the table while the other men retired to the bunkhouse, using the time to discuss the day's events or plans for the coming week. For her part, Nora found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations. They reminded her of the intellectual companionship she had briefly enjoyed with Thomas before his military service and subsequent illness had created a distance between them. Garrett respected her thoughts and valued her practical suggestions, never dismissing her ideas because she was a woman. As May gave way to June, the ranch burst into full spring activity. Cattle were moved to higher pastures, fields were planted with additional crops at Nora's suggestion, and the days grew longer and warmer. Elizabeth thrived in the clean mountain air, growing plumper and more alert each day. One bright afternoon, Nora was in the garden she had started behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Garrett riding in with a package tied to his saddle. "Afternoon," he called, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. "Brought something back from town for you and Elizabeth." Nora stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "For us? That wasn't necessary." "Maybe not, but I wanted to," he said, untying the package and bringing it to her. "Go ahead, open it." Inside was a length of cheerful yellow calico fabric, a small wooden toy horse for Elizabeth, and a paper-wrapped parcel that proved to contain peppermint sticks. "Garrett, this is too generous," Nora protested, even as she ran her fingers over the lovely fabric. "Nonsense," he said. "You've saved me more than the cost of these things with your improvements to the kitchen stores alone." "Besides," he added more softly, "I thought the yellow would suit you. Reminds me of sunshine." The simple compliment brought heat to Nora's cheeks, and she found herself uncharacteristically speechless. No one had given her a gift, much less one so thoughtfully selected, since before Thomas fell ill. "Thank you," she managed finally. "It's beautiful. I'll make a new dress right away." Garrett smiled, looking pleased with her reaction. "How's the little one today?" "Growing stronger every day," Nora replied, grateful for the change of subject. "She's napping now, but she's begun trying to crawl. I can barely keep up with her." "She's got her mother's determination," Garrett observed. "Speaking of which, how is your garden coming along?" Nora gestured to the neat rows she had planted. "The seeds you provided are sprouting well. We should have fresh vegetables by July if the weather holds." "Good thinking to start it," he said, surveying her work with approval. "My mother always kept a garden, but it went to weeds after she passed. Never had the time or knowledge to restore it myself. I'm happy to bring it back to life," Nora said. "It gives me pleasure to see things grow." Garrett's gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer than usual. "You've brought more than the garden back to life, Nora," he said quietly. Before she could respond to this startling statement, they were interrupted by the arrival of Daniel, who needed Garrett's input on a matter concerning the north pasture fence. With a tip of his hat and a last warm glance, Garrett left to attend to ranch business, leaving Nora to ponder his words. That night, as she carefully cut the yellow calico to make herself a new dress, Nora found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her life had taken. What had begun as desperate circumstances had somehow transformed into something that felt increasingly like belonging. The Double G Ranch was becoming home, and its quiet owner was becoming. What exactly? A friend, certainly. A respected employer. But the warmth that spread through her chest when Garrett smiled at her suggested something more complicated was developing. Something that both excited and frightened her. Widowed less than 6 months, dependent on his generosity for her livelihood, and her daughter's security, these were not circumstances that made for sound judgment about matters of the heart. And yet, Nora could not deny that something was growing between them, as steady and promising as the seeds in her garden. For now, she decided, she would tend that feeling carefully, neither rushing its growth nor denying its existence. Time would reveal whether it was meant to flourish or fade. July brought scorching heat to the valley, and with it came new challenges. The creek that supplied water to the ranch began to run low, and the cattle grew restless in the heat. Everyone worked harder, starting before dawn to accomplish tasks before the worst of the midday sun made labor nearly impossible. Nora adjusted the household routine accordingly, preparing cold meals for midday and saving cooking for the cooler morning and evening hours. She learned to manage Elizabeth's naps to coincide with the hottest part of the day, when they would both rest in the relative coolness of the stone-floored kitchen. It was during one such afternoon, with Elizabeth asleep on a blanket nearby, that Nora heard urgent voices outside. Setting aside the mending she had been working on, she went to the door to find several of the hands rushing toward the bunkhouse, supporting a limping, blood-stained Garrett between them. "What happened?" she gasped, hurrying to hold the door open as they maneuvered him inside. "Bull got him," Otto explained grimly. "Gored his leg and threw him against the corral fence." "Get him to his room," Nora directed, her mind racing. "I'll fetch water and bandages." By the time she had gathered supplies and reached Garrett's bedroom, the men had removed his boots and were cutting away his torn, blood-soaked trouser leg. Garrett himself was conscious but pale with pain, his jaw clenched tight. "Doc Simmons is out at the Henderson place," Frank reported. "Won't be back till tomorrow at the earliest." Nora set down her basin and bandages. "Let me see." The men stepped back, giving her room to examine the wound. It was ugly, a deep puncture on the outer thigh with considerable bruising already forming around it. But the bleeding, while profuse, didn't have the pulsing quality that would indicate an arterial injury. "I need clean cloths, my sewing basket, and the whiskey from the kitchen cupboard," she said decisively. "And I'll need one of you to help me." "You know what you're doing?" Otto asked, not challenging but needing reassurance. Nora nodded. "My father was often called upon to help when the doctor was unavailable in our town. I assisted him many times." This seemed to satisfy the men, who quickly brought the requested items. Otto stayed to help, his weathered hands steady as he followed Nora's instructions. "This will hurt," she warned Garrett as she cleaned the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth. He managed a tight smile. "Can't hurt worse than it already does." But he was wrong. As she probed the wound to ensure no cloth or dirt remained, his body went rigid with pain, and a groan escaped him despite his efforts to remain stoic. "Almost done with the worst part," she assured him, working as quickly as thoroughness would allow. The wound required 12 neat stitches, which Nora placed with steady hands despite her inner distress at causing Garrett pain. Through it all, he remained conscious, watching her work with an intensity that suggested he was focusing on her face to distract from the agony. "You have a gentle touch," he said hoarsely when she had finished and was applying a clean bandage. "Try not to talk," Nora replied, though his words warmed her. "You need to rest now." With Otto's help, she got Garrett settled more comfortably on his bed, propping his injured leg on a folded blanket and covering him with a light sheet. By the time they had finished, his eyes had closed in exhausted sleep. "You did good work there," Otto said quietly as they left the room. "Neat as any doctor I've seen." "Thank you for your help," Nora replied. "I'll need to check on him regularly to watch for fever." Otto nodded. "I'll tell the boys. One of us will be nearby if you need anything." True to her word, Nora checked on Garrett every hour throughout the evening and night, leaving Elizabeth in the care of Daniel's wife Sarah, who had come from town to help when word of the accident spread. The ranch hands took turns standing guard outside the house, ready to ride for the doctor at the first sign of serious trouble. By morning, Garrett's injury showed no signs of the dangerous red streaks that would indicate infection, though he had developed a mild fever. He woke when Nora changed his bandage, his eyes clearer than they had been the previous evening. "You've been here all night," he observed, taking in her tired face. "Of course," she said simply, adjusting his pillows. "How is the pain?" "Manageable," he replied, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. "You should get some rest yourself." "I will," she promised. Sarah is watching Elizabeth, and she's brought some broth for you. Do you think you could manage a little? He nodded, and Nora helped him into a slightly more upright position, careful not to disturb his injured leg. She held the cup to his lips, steadying it as he drank. Never thought I'd find myself being nursed by an angel, he murmured, fatigue and perhaps the lingering effects of pain making him more forthright than usual. Nora felt heat rise to her face. Hardly an angel, just doing what anyone would. Not anyone, Garrett insisted, his hand capturing hers as she took the cup away. You. Thank you, Nora. The simple sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. You're welcome, Garrett. Now rest. Dr. Simmons should be here by afternoon to check my work. He kept hold of her hand a moment longer, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that seemed both deliberate and unconscious at once. Then he released her and closed his eyes, following her instructions as obediently as any of his ranch hands would follow his. Dr. Simmons arrived late that afternoon, examined the wound with professional efficiency, and declared Nora's treatment exemplary. Couldn't have done better myself, the elderly physician pronounced. Keep it clean, change the bandage daily, and keep him off that leg for at least 2 weeks. After that, limited activity for another 2 a month. Garrett protested from his bed. Doc, I can't be laid up that long. It's high summer, there's too much work. Would you rather lose the leg? Simmons countered bluntly. Or your life? Bull gores are nasty business, Grayson. You're lucky this young lady knew what she was about, or we might be having a very different conversation. That sobered Garrett, who subsided with a reluctant nod. I understand. Good, the doctor said, packing up his bag. I'll be back in a week to check on you, but send for me if there's any change for the worse. After he had gone, Nora brought Garrett a proper meal, tender beef stew and fresh bread, setting up a small table beside his bed. I suppose you're going to enforce the doctor's orders, Garrett said ruefully as she arranged everything within his reach. To the letter, Nora confirmed with a small smile. I didn't go to all the trouble of saving your leg to have you ruin my handiwork by being stubborn. He chuckled, wincing slightly at the movement. Fair enough. But the ranch, Otto has things well in hand, she assured him. And I've spoken with Daniel about the accounts. Everything will be managed until you're back on your feet. Garrett studied her face for a long moment. You're quite remarkable, you know that. The simple compliment, delivered with such earnest admiration, caught Nora off guard. I'm just doing what needs to be done, she demurred. No, Garrett said, his voice growing serious. You're doing far more than that. You've brought order and comfort to this house. You've gained the respect of every man on this ranch. And now you've quite possibly saved my life. I think that might be an exaggeration, Nora said, uncomfortable with such praise. It's not, he insisted. And I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide to do in the future, you and Elizabeth will always have a place here. Your family now, Nora. Both of you. The word struck Nora with unexpected force. Family. The thing the Harringtons had denied her and Elizabeth. The thing she had thought lost to her forever when Thomas died. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't need to say anything, Garrett replied. Just know that it's true. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Nora felt something shift between them, something profound and irrevocable. But before either could speak further, Elizabeth's cries sounded from the other room, and the moment passed. I should go to her, Nora said, rising. Garrett nodded. Go ahead. And Nora? Thank you. For everything. As July gave way to August, Garrett's recovery progressed steadily under Nora's attentive care. He proved to be a better patient than she had anticipated, perhaps because his enforced convalescence gave him more time with her and Elizabeth than his usual duties allowed. Elizabeth, now 9 months old, had taken to crawling with determined energy and had developed a particular attachment to Garrett. She would pull herself up using the edge of his bed during Nora's visits to change his bandages, babbling happily and offering him whatever small treasure she had clutched in her chubby hand, a wooden spoon, a smooth stone, once even a startled grasshopper that had somehow found its way into the house. She's going to be walking soon, Garrett observed one afternoon as he sat in a chair by the window, his injured leg propped on a stool, watching Elizabeth cruise along the edge of his bed. Strong-willed, like her mother. Is that how you see me? Strong-willed, Nora asked, curious. Garrett considered this. Strong-willed, yes, but also kind, intelligent, and remarkably resilient. Not many women could have endured what you have and emerged with such grace. The compliment warmed her, but it also reminded her of all she had not told him. In their growing closeness, she had shared many details of her life, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's shop, her brief courtship with Thomas, but she had never fully explained the circumstances that had brought her west. Garrett, she began hesitantly, there's something I should tell you about why I left Boston. He turned his full attention to her, his expression open. I'm listening. Nora took a deep breath, gathering her courage. When my husband died, his family, they accused me of infidelity. They claimed Elizabeth couldn't be Thomas's child because of the timing of her birth. Anger flashed across Garrett's face. That's absurd. Elizabeth came early, Nora explained, the words tumbling out now that she had begun. Thomas had been away for 4 months before her birth, but the doctor confirmed she was premature. The Harringtons chose not to believe it. They were looking for a reason to be rid of me. They never approved of Thomas marrying a shopkeeper's daughter. So they cast you out? A grieving widow with an infant. The disgust in his voice was palpable. Nora nodded, unable to meet his eyes. They gave me enough money for the journey west, but made it clear I was never to use the Harrington name again or make any claim on their family. Look at me, Nora, Garrett said gently. She raised her eyes reluctantly, afraid of what she might see in his face, judgment, perhaps, or doubt. Instead, she found only compassion and a burning indignation on her behalf. What they did was unforgivable, he said, and it says everything about their character and nothing about yours. Relief washed through her at his unhesitating belief. I've been afraid to tell you, she admitted. Afraid you might think that you would deceive your husband? That Elizabeth isn't his child? Garrett shook his head firmly. Never. I know the kind of woman you are, Nora Davenport. And those people, they didn't deserve to be called your family. Elizabeth chose that moment to lose her balance and plop down on her bottom with a surprised expression that quickly transformed into giggles. The tension broke as both adults smiled at the child's resilience. Thank you, Nora said softly, for believing me, for giving us a home when we had none. Garrett reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his own. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. I meant what I said before. You and Elizabeth are family now. The way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made Nora wonder if perhaps he meant something more, something neither of them had yet dared to name. By mid-August, Garrett was well enough to move around the house with the aid of a crutch, though he still tired easily and was forbidden from resuming his full duties. This partial recovery coincided with the arrival of a letter that would test the fragile new understanding between them. Nora was preparing dinner when Garrett limped into the kitchen, a folded paper in his hand and an unreadable expression on his face. This came for you, he said, extending the letter. Ryder brought it from town. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope, surprised to see the Boston postmark and the elegantly penned address. She didn't recognize the handwriting. Aren't you going to open it? Garrett asked when she simply stood staring at it. Yes, of course, she said, breaking the seal with fingers that trembled slightly. The letter was brief but shocking. It was from Thomas's aunt, Margaret Harrington, informing Nora that Thomas's father had died unexpectedly of a stroke. In his final days, apparently overcome with remorse, he had confessed the wrong done to Nora and Elizabeth and had changed his will to provide for them both a substantial trust fund for Elizabeth and an allowance for Nora that would ensure their comfort for life. Margaret explained that she had always doubted her brother-in-law's accusations and had finally convinced her husband to help her locate Nora. She urged Nora to return to Boston, where she would be welcomed into the family properly and where Elizabeth could take her rightful place as a Harrington heir. What is it? Garrett asked, concern evident in his voice as he watched the color drain from Nora's face. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. As he read, his expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. So, he said when he had finished, carefully folding the letter and placing it on the table between them. You're going back. It wasn't a question, but a statement delivered with careful neutrality. I don't know, Nora said honestly. I haven't had time to think. What's to think about? Garrett's voice had an edge she had never heard before. Financial security for life. Respectability. Everything you came west hoping to find. That's not fair, she protested. I didn't come west looking for a fortune. I came hoping for honest work and a chance to raise my daughter in peace. And now you have the chance to raise her as an heiress instead, he said, turning away to look out the window. It's a good opportunity, Nora. You should take it. His dismissive tone stung. All the more because it seemed so out of character for the man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect for months. Is that what you think of me? She asked quietly. That I would abandon the life I've built here, the home you said Elizabeth and I would always have for money? Garrett didn't answer immediately, his shoulders tense beneath his shirt. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was carefully controlled. I think, he said slowly, that any mother would want the best possible future for her child. The Harringtons can give Elizabeth advantages that a struggling cattle ranch in Colorado never could. Advantages? Nora echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. The same Harringtons who called her mother a whore and her existence a shame? Who would have let us starve rather than acknowledge her as blood? Those are the people you think will give her advantages. People change, Garrett said, though he sounded less convinced now. Some do, Nora agreed. And some merely say what's convenient when their previous position becomes untenable. She shook her head, disappointment welling up inside her. I thought you knew me better than to believe I would make such a decision based solely on money. Then what will you base it on? He challenged. The question hung between them, demanding an answer that Nora wasn't sure she was ready to give. What was keeping her here, if not the security and comfort Garrett provided? What ties bound her to this place, this life, beyond gratitude and dependence? Before she could formulate a response, Elizabeth crawled into the kitchen, pulling herself up against Nora's skirts with a happy gurgle. The sight of her daughter's trusting face clarified Nora's thoughts with unexpected sharpness. I'll base it on where Elizabeth will be truly loved and accepted for who she is, she said, lifting the child into her arms. On where we can build a life of honesty and dignity. On where we belong. And where is that? Garrett asked, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. Nora met his gaze steadily. I don't know yet, but I won't be rushed into a decision by this letter, nor will I be pushed away by your sudden coldness. Elizabeth and I deserve better than either. With that, she carried her daughter from the kitchen, leaving Garrett standing alone with the letter that had threatened to upend the life they had been building together. For 3 days, an uncomfortable tension hung over the ranch house. Nora continued her duties with meticulous care, and Garrett was unfailingly polite, but the easy companionship they had developed was noticeably absent. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations limited to practical matters of household management and Garrett's continuing recovery. The ranch hands sensed the change, but wisely kept their observations to themselves, though Otto's concerned glances followed both Nora and Garrett whenever they were in the same room. On the 4th day, a late summer thunderstorm swept through the valley, bringing welcome rain but confining everyone to their respective shelters. By evening, the downpour had settled into a steady rhythm against the roof, and Nora sat in the parlor, mending one of Garrett's shirts by lamplight after putting Elizabeth to bed. She heard Garrett's uneven footsteps before she saw him, the familiar sound of his crutch accompanying his approach. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. May I join you? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Nora nodded, setting aside her mending. Of course. He made his way to the chair opposite hers, lowering himself carefully and stretching his injured leg out before him. For a long moment, neither spoke, the only sounds the hiss of the lamp and the persistent drumming of rain. I owe you an apology, Garrett finally said, breaking the silence. My reaction to your letter was unfair. Nora studied his face, noting the fatigue that lined it and the sincerity in his eyes. Why did you react that way? She asked simply. He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as signaling discomfort with emotional topics. Fear, I suppose, he admitted. Fear that you would leave. That you should leave, for Elizabeth's sake. That I had no right to ask you to stay. You didn't ask me to stay, Nora pointed out gently. No, he agreed. Instead, I tried to push you away before you could choose to go. It was cowardly. The frank self-assessment surprised her. Not cowardly, she countered. Human. We all protect ourselves from pain when we can. At what cost, though? Garrett leaned forward, his gaze intent on her face. "Nora, these past months with you and Elizabeth here, they've changed everything. This house is a home again. The ranch feels alive in a way it hasn't since my parents died. It's been important to us, too," Nora said carefully, uncertain where he was leading. "More than important," Garrett insisted. "Necessary. You've become necessary to me, Nora. Not just your cooking or your help with the books or even your medical skills, though God knows I'm grateful for all of those. Your strength, your kindness, your way of seeing beauty where others might miss it." Nora's heart quickened at his words, at the raw emotion behind them. "Garrett, please," he interrupted. "Let me finish while I still have the courage." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Nora Davenport. I love Elizabeth as if she were my own. And the thought of losing you both to a family that once cast you aside is more than I can bear." The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and utterly transformative. Nora felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I love you too," she whispered, the words emerging with the clarity of absolute truth. "I think perhaps I have for some time now." Garrett's face transformed with wonder and relief. In 2 movements, he was kneeling before her chair, ignoring the pain it must have caused his injured leg, taking both her hands in his. "Then stay," he said fervently, "not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. Let me be a father to Elizabeth. Let me love you both for the rest of my days." "Are you certain?" Nora asked, needing to be sure. "The Harrington's letter changes nothing for you?" "It changes nothing that matters," Garrett assured her. "Money can't create a family. Love does that. And we already are a family, aren't we? You, me, and Elizabeth." Nora nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, we are." "Then say yes," he urged, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Say you'll marry me, Nora." "Yes," she said, her heart too full for elaborate speeches. "Yes, Garrett Grayson, I will marry you." With reverent gentleness, he leaned forward and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future shared. As the rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, Nora felt the last pieces of her shattered world fall perfectly into place. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Delta, with Elizabeth balanced on Otto's hip as the entire ranch turned out to witness the union. Nora wore a new dress of blue silk that Garrett had ordered specially from Denver, and he stood tall and proud beside her, his leg nearly healed and his face alight with happiness. "I, Garrett, take you, Nora, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed in a voice that carried to every corner of the church. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I, Nora, take you, Garrett, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she responded, her own voice steady with conviction. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic of his ranch hands. And when they turned to face their gathered friends, Elizabeth reached out from Otto's arms, clearly wanting to be part of the celebration. Garrett took her, settling her comfortably on his hip as he offered his other arm to Nora. Together, they walked back down the aisle, no longer rancher and housekeeper, but a family united by choice and love. The celebration at the ranch afterward was joyous and lasted well into the night. The bunkhouse cook, determined to prove he had learned something during Nora's tenure, produced a feast that, while not quite up to her standards, was heartily enjoyed by all. There was dancing in the yard, with lanterns strung from tree to tree, and even Elizabeth was passed from partner to partner for a turn around the makeshift dance floor. As the evening drew to a close, Nora found herself standing with Garrett on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching the last of the revelry. "Happy, Mrs. Grayson?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I should check on Elizabeth soon." "Already done," he said. "Sarah has her settled in the nursery we prepared. Our little one was sound asleep, worn out from all the excitement. Our little one." The casual claim of fatherhood warmed Nora's heart. "You're going to be a wonderful father," she said softly. I hope so, Garrett replied, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. I want to give her everything: security, education, opportunities. Everything a father should provide. You already give her the most important thing, Nora said. Love without condition or reservation. He smiled at that, pressing a kiss to her temple. That's the easy part. She's impossible not to love. Like her mother? Nora teased gently. Exactly like her mother, he confirmed, turning her in his arms to face him fully. I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again, Nora. After losing so much, I'd convinced myself that the ranch was enough, that duty and work would fill the emptiness. And now, she prompted. Now I know better, he said simply. Now I have everything that matters right here. As they stood together in the soft September evening, the sounds of celebration gradually fading as their guests departed, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the grief and rejection she had experienced in Boston to the uncertain hope that had propelled her west, through the rain-soaked desperation of her arrival in Delta to the sense of purpose she had found at the Double G Ranch. And finally, to this, a love she had not sought but had found nonetheless, a family forged through choice rather than blood, a home built on mutual respect and shared dreams. What are you thinking about? Garrett asked, noting her contemplative expression. About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best, she replied honestly. If the Harringtons hadn't cast me out, I never would have come west. Never would have found you. Garrett's arms tightened around her. Then I suppose I owe them a debt of gratitude, though I'll never forgive them for the pain they caused you. I've written to Margaret Harrington, Nora admitted, to thank her for her letter and to inform her of our marriage. And of your decision to stay here? Garrett asked, a hint of lingering insecurity in his voice. I told her that Elizabeth and I have found our true family, Nora said, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. That no inheritance could compare to the love and acceptance we've found here. Satisfied with her answer, Garrett lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments: quiet, perfect connections between two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed most. As the last of their wedding guests called goodnight and headed toward town or the bunkhouse, Garrett took Nora's hand and led her inside to begin their new life together, not as savior and rescued, employer and employee, but as equal partners in whatever joys and challenges lay ahead. 2 years later, on a crisp October morning, Nora stood at the kitchen window watching Garrett in the yard with Elizabeth. At 3 years old, Elizabeth was a lively, curious child with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's love of the outdoors. Garrett was teaching her to ride her very own pony, a gentle creature he had specially selected and trained for her. Not too fast, Nora called through the open window, though she knew Garrett was being careful. He looked up with a grin. She's a natural, Nora, just like her mother. Elizabeth beamed at the praise, her small hands gripping the specially made saddle with its safety straps that Garrett had insisted upon. Look, Mama, I'm riding all by myself. I see, sweetheart, Nora called back, pride and love swelling in her chest. You're doing wonderfully. The sound of a baby's cry from the next room drew Nora's attention away from the riding lesson. She moved quickly to the cradle where 6-month-old James Garrett Grayson was just waking from his morning nap. Hello, my little man, she crooned, lifting the sturdy boy into her arms. He immediately calmed at her touch, his father's dark eyes gazing up at her with trust and contentment. James had arrived after a surprisingly easy labor the previous spring, bringing with him a joy that had expanded their family in ways Nora had once thought impossible. Garrett had been beside himself with pride and emotion, holding his son with a reverence that spoke of all the love he had to give. The front door opened, and Garrett entered with Elizabeth perched on his shoulders, both of them flushed with exercise and happiness. How's our boy? He asked, carefully lowering Elizabeth to the floor. Perfect, Nora replied, passing James to his father's waiting arms. Just woke from his nap. Garrett cradled his son with practiced ease, the tenderness in his expression making Nora fall in love with him all over again, as she did nearly every day. And how is our accomplished horsewoman? She asked, turning to Elizabeth, who was bouncing with excitement. Papa says I can name my pony, Elizabeth announced. I want to call her Star because she has a white star on her nose. That's a fine name, Nora agreed, smoothing her daughter's windblown hair. Can we write to Aunt Margaret and tell her about Star? Elizabeth asked. And send a picture of James too? Nora exchanged a glance with Garrett, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, we can do that, she said. Margaret Harrington had become an unexpected connection to Thomas's family, writing regularly and even sending gifts for the children. She had never pressed Nora to return to Boston or to accept the inheritance set aside for Elizabeth, though she assured them it remained available should they ever need it. Instead, she seemed content to know that her grandniece was thriving in her Colorado home, loved by both her mother and the man who had chosen to be her father in every way that mattered. I'll help you write the letter after lunch, Nora promised. Now go wash up while I finish preparing the meal. As Elizabeth scampered off to do as she was told, Garrett stepped closer to Nora, James still contentedly cradled in one arm. With his free hand, he tucked a stray strand of hair behind Nora's ear, his touch lingering on her cheek. Have I told you today how much I love you, Mrs. Grayson? He asked softly. You might have mentioned it this morning, Nora replied with a smile, but I never tire of hearing it. I love you, he said simply, and I am grateful every day that you chose to stay, to build this life with me. The best choice I ever made, Nora assured him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him gently. Their moment was interrupted by Elizabeth's return and her announcement that she was starving like a bear after hibernation, a phrase she had clearly picked up from one of the ranch hands. Laughing, the family gathered around the table, Garrett at the head, Nora beside him with James in her lap, and Elizabeth chattering away about her pony and all the adventures they would have. As Nora looked at the faces of her husband and children, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her place in the world after so much uncertainty. The journey that had begun in grief and rejection had led her to this, a home filled with love, a family bonded by choice and commitment, a life richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. Outside the window, the Double G Ranch stretched toward the mountains, a legacy they were building together for Elizabeth and James and perhaps other children yet to come. Inside, in the warmth of their kitchen, was everything that truly mattered, the family that had claimed each other, not through blood or obligation, but through the enduring power of love freely given and gratefully received. And Nora, once cast out and abandoned, knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged,